How are you? Welcome to Critical Moves of Telesur. In times of pandemic, there are new commemorations that are impossible to oversee. One of them is the victory over the Nazi Germany. So, what are the actors that were involved? What was the next world ordering? Was the peace already sealed with the victory of the Red Army over Nazi Germany? This is what we're going to be analyzing. Let's begin. Let's listen to some statements of this commemoration on behalf of some presidents. What our country and our allies did was to save liberty, not only here but everywhere. Great Britain, the Commonwealth, and the UK were the only countries that fought against Hitler as of the first day until the last one, without being defeated or being occupied. For a complete year, from 1940 and 41, we were alone against Hitler. We were the last straw on the peg. Now we are compromised with the pandemic, and we have to have the same high spirits. This means that we cannot have the parades as we've had in the past. So everybody of us that we were born after 1945, we are fully aware that we owe everything that we have to that generation that won World War II. Yes, Germans can now say that we are happy with the day of the liberation. Now we can say it with total liberty. For all of us, May 9th is the day of the victory. It is with us forever. The date itself cannot be canceled or reprogrammed. We will not do it. Every family will recall and honor their heroes. Let's see a map of World War II on the base of the actors that were confronted. Actors of World War II, Axis and allies. Second World War was a conflict that went on from 1939 to 1945. Up until then, great powers were the main actors, and they took in two groups that were based against each other. One, the Axis and the Allies. The Axis were Germany, whose government was led by Adolf Hitler and unleashed the conflict. Italy, that adhered to Germany in 1940, but since they had no organization or resource, they had no success. Japan was also part of the Axis, but their action was more in the Asian Pacific. Their most important act was the attack on Pearl Harbor. Then the Allies were the UK, that declared the war on Germany in 1939 in defense of the rights of Poland. France, that was also part in 1939 after the invasion of the Nazis on French territory. And 1941, the Soviet Union, after their attempt of Germany to go invade their lands. Russia was in charge of 80% of killing the people in Germany. One of the most important battles was Stalingrad. This was a decisive point for the victory of the Allies. On December 9th of 1941, China declared the war on Germany. One of the last one was the war of Pearl Harbor on behalf of Japan. In 1939, the United States declared itself neutral, but then in 1941, they adhered to the Allies. White House declared the war on the Japanese, and as of then, they became part of the Allies. And of course, they were added to Germany and Italy. Other countries decided to be neutral, be this because of the distance or because they had no resources to participate in a war of these proportions. But in one or another way, they supported one of the two parties. Having done this overview, we will see information that comes via digital websites. For example, Xinhua says Putin and Trump speak on the phone about COVID-19 and the anniversary of V-Day. Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump spoke about things related to COVID virus, and they exchanged congratulations for the 45th anniversary of the end of World War II. This was issued by the Kremlin. In the discussion about the coronavirus, there was a positive evaluation of the bilateral cooperation, and they agreed to keep on promoting this type of cooperation. Particularly, the United States offered to send Russia some medical equipment. Trump and Putin agreed that both countries should have advances in many topics if they continue working together. This is to fight terrorism, solve regional conflicts, and confront epidemics. Nevertheless, let's see how this confirmation contrasts. So let's go to Sputnik. On May 7th, they said Pentagon tells their version of the V-Day with an invasion, with a Soviet invasion. When recalling the day of the victory, United States blamed Russia for the beginning of World War II and strategically mentioned the importance of the Soviet army in the end of the conflict. The Pentagon put an air that said Victory Day of Europe, a day of celebration. And they recall the historical version that they have. This is V-Day. Germany turned in their forces to the Allies, including the United States. Afterwards, they said that when they disembarked the Allies on Normandy in France on June 6th of 1944, this marked the beginning of the end of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. And just 1 year later, they would give up, and Adolf Hitler was dead. But at no point they spoke of the War of Berlin that was carried out by the Soviet troops. And this is why the Reich gave up the capital city of Germany. The Americans also forget that the end of the World War II and the total dissolution of the Third Reich would not have been possible if without the support of Russia. So apparently, they think that in 1939 this all began. And the United States strategically forgets everything that came before the USSR would sign the agreement of non-attack, when of course they took in Czechoslovakia to the war. To finalize their version, the Pentagon says that the areas of Western Europe that was liberated by the Allies would become prosperous democracy, while the liberated on the east were occupied by the Soviet forces. They conveniently also forget that in August of 1945, the United States launched 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and killed over 200,000 civilians. Having done this declaration, let's go to our first pause, and we do it through the person of the day. So in the commemoration of B-Day, let's reflect on the following. Is the world peace ensured now? Participate with us. There are several hashtags that have been set to commemorate one day or the other, the V-Day.
Victory Day, VE Day, Jour de la Victoire, Seconda Guerra Mondiale, Tac de Sigues, entre otras. A la pausa.
After the pause, we'll be right back. The young people will never understand what we lived during the war. We lived with no electricity, no gas. no microwave, no refrigerator. We never threw anything onto the trash. There is nothing that compares of being shut down because of the World War II or this pandemic. People now might think so, but it has no comparison to what we lived in the Second World War. To compare is like almost like comparing it to the Holocaust. I lived it in a very different way. I lived the Holocaust in every way. I lived hid with a false name, but at least I could go to school. I was 5 years old and I could leave because the risk did not come from the air, but from potential traitors, those who could betray us. We lived with a permanent fear. Even when we were kids, they transmitted the fears of our parents. We lived with fears of the bombarding. That has no comparison to anything of what we're living now. At that point, I was a 17-year-old student. Then, like a bomb, a Molotov bomb came. The Foreign Affairs Minister of the USSR on June 22 of 1939, the war began. Hitler had attacked us. When Nazi Germany was neutralized in 1945 with what is called the V-Day, Second World War came to an end. Let's see the facts. Between 1939 and 1945, the Second World War was carried out. The worst war in history up until now. Everything began with the invasion of Germany to Poland. Among the causes were the unrest of Germany because of the Versailles Agreement, fascism represented by Hitler in Germany and Benito Mussolini in Italy, and they created ultra-nationalist movements. One of the worst crimes of the German fascism was the so-called Holocaust. Millions of people, among those Jewish, Islamic, and extremists were exterminated in concentration camps. For years, many governments contrasted this, and they faced each other. And then the two groups became the Axis and the Allies. France, Germany, United States, and the USSR were the Allies. Millions of dead and injured, hunger. All of this was what the war left. The war was fought in the streets of Berlin. The participation of the Red Army was pivotal for the extinction of the armed conflict. Everything before Hitler had spread through Europe without having much resistance. Regardless of which, United States, through a strong propaganda, they make everybody understand that it was them who closed the war, but it's not true. It was because of the Red Army that the World War II came to an end. In Russia, today's Russia, they have a representation of a great festivity because all families in Russia had somebody who had gone to this war. It is a huge party, and like it was back then. So today we're going to have Dr. Mindo. He's a vast international analyst. Thank you, Doctor, for coming to our program. Hi, Ray. Greetings. It's so nice to talk to you. Let's hope the communication is good this time. Let's hope so. Because today we're commemorating the 45 years of the putting of an end of World War II in the midst of the pandemic that we are now living, and now we're reflecting on what is going on, what has happened, and what is upcoming. Of the material we have seen, Doctor, what are the facts that you think are convenient to highlight nowadays and go a bit further in this analysis? Well, dear Ray, I would say that it's very concerning how history is being rewritten by the capitalist regimes that are represented by the United States and some other countries in Europe. There is a tendency to reject the origin of World War II, and even more, they make the the Soviets, the responsible. Those are the biggest. Those are the biggest victims. Let's not forget the Munich Pact, where Russia and France they accept the space of the Nazi government, which is the expression of the great bourgeoisie of Germany to conquer the world and stop socialism that was represented by Russia. So it's important to say that the Soviet Union tried to ask for an alliance among the bourgeoisie groups in France, and also with other groups of London, and they were going to confront a war front to go against the USSR. Let's not forget that the bourgeoisie denied the possibility of this agreement, and they didn't want to. They also worked on the destruction of our Spanish country. But we must also recall the opportunity that the Soviet government, the Soviet party had chance to win time and prepare the defenses of the country with the certainty that there was going to be an aggression on their soil. That, of course, happened, which was tragic for them, with a peace process that was signed, because both countries, Germany and USSR, knew that it was just a masquerade, and on behalf of the USSR it was just a wish to win time, but that the main wish of the USSR was not to sign an agreement with the dictator, but on the contrary, it was to and what they wanted to do is that what they wanted at the end of the day was to push this criminal fury of Germany towards the USSR, so they would destroy the USSR. This was the secret reason behind all of this, and this is why there was expansionism. And of course, it wasn't that the Nazis wanted to do that on their own, but of these bourgeoisie governments of France and Great Britain, that they really had to see it hard when there was an invasion and bombardings on Germany. Okay, thank you, Doctor. Let me include in this dialogue Mr. Rodriguez. He's a political analyst. He is talking to us from Russia. David, how are you? I would like to take this opportunity, since you are in Europe, can you please tell us what is the situation in Russia and how this commemoration is lived? A commemoration that we cannot say that has to do exclusively with the people, with the government, but on the contrary, it has to do with all of the people in Russia. Well, hello, everybody that is watching us, that watches us through the cameras. In fact, we have to reivindicate the feeling of the Russians in terms of the state. It is important that we see through the German eyes, the suffering and the great sacrifice that the Soviet Union has ensured the peace, and also tried to go forward with the extermination of a fascist government. And of course, let's not forget that they wanted to keep on expanding with the criminal system of understanding the society and development of life. It's important that we not only show solidarity with those representations that are melancholic that the Russian people live every time that the state comes around. It has to do with over 27 million people that died. These are the combatants that gave their lives to ensure the end of World War II and finally put a stop on the advance of fascism and show the world who was the strongest one. And in this case, there was a demonstration of how big the Soviet Union was. I think that people don't understand the human loss, but if we can say that it was 135 liters, 135,000 liters of blood that was spilled. We could make 3 rivers with that. It's also important to see how strong it was and the sacrifice that it meant to all of the Soviet Union. Nowadays, we know, and people go to the streets. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we are not able to watch the parade or any type of manifestation of which we are so used to. On behalf of the Russians, there is, of course, an aerial parade. President Putin has ensured that they will fly over the sea, and there will be a commemoration through an air parade on this important day. However, once on the streets, you can see that in all of Russia, that the commemoration is important, and also in the windows and the terrace, it will be seen the pictures of all of those who combated and that fought in this war. So it's important that we understand that practically half of the Russian population was present at the war, and they turned in their lives to stop what Nazi Germany was. This is why the history should reivindicate, and we should continue in some way a movement of reivindication through the different social movements, historians, political movements, this reivindication of the Soviet Union as the determining element to do away with the Axis and put away the fascist government of Germany. So, yes, thank you, David. We will continue investigating on history books. Now let's go back to my first guest. You said that those string of actors that became the Axis that was led by the United States, France, and Great Britain, and on the other hand, Soviet Union. What do you think is the role that each one had to play? That's my first question. And now can you please tell me, since when do you think that there was a neo rupture of what happened and was like a forecasting of what happened later? And do you think that it was already suspected what would happen in the times of the World War, of Second World War II? Yes. Look, the severity, the aggressiveness of the possibility that the world itself could go to the hands of the criminal dictatorship and their allies, who were not few in Europe. And this took Great Britain and the United States, that as of 1940-41, they had to change the policy to make it really fast, because they understood that the combat of the Soviet Union was fundamental to crush the huge danger of Nazi Germany. So there was an anti-fascist agreement. In fact, there were some fallens in a huge combat. The French fell when the Germans took over them. And of course they took over France, and there were two sectors. One region that was that administered all of the services and money of France, and then the other one that just did all of the political moves. But of course, Great Britain, it's true that along with the United States, had a support, gave support to Soviet Union that was able to defeat the Nazi invasion, avoided the invasion of Moscow, and also avoided the invasion of Leningrad, and then did away with the Germans in the Battle of Stalingrad. This is already at the beginning of 1941, by totally changing the sense of the war. I would say something else. We are speaking of Russia. The political system of Russia reivindicates the anti-fascism, the huge victory of the Russian people. So let's not forget that the Soviet Union is not the same political subject that the Russian Federation. Russia is born in 1922 and was able to have 16 countries, that back then there were only like 13 countries, and the politics of the party was able to attain the unity against the fascism of everybody. That was not only the Germans. There were also other countries where there was a mosaic of ethnies, and in the Caucasus. So it was a brilliant action on behalf of the people, with Stalin leading them. And to all of this, I think it's important to carry out a country that liberates humanity. However you want to put the propaganda of the Trump administration in the United States, it is impossible to erase the history and erase the 30 million deaths and the actions of the Red Army that represented the forceful action. So it's also a victory of Stalin that is so not well seen in this ad that was issued. I would like to ask you, to what point was humanity able to take the anti-Soviet propaganda that was pushed by the United States? Well, let me say, it's not the same 1945 than 1995. In 1945, all of the public opinion, including the countries that have fought against the Nazi regime, everybody recognized the huge role Russia had, even when it was with Stalin or Hitler. So yes, there were many countries in Europe that were liberated. And Stalin wants to restart all of these countries and make them successful democracies. Let's not forget, however, that the United Nations Charter also imposes natural law, and how they asked the student that there was a huge effort of the country to win the industrial patrimony that was added up in 1939. Without this patrimony, it was impossible there would be any victory over fascism. So it's not only a heroic act, but it's also a technological act of the Russian Soviet country through the industrial acts. And that's, of course, with it was impossible to work this in other countries because they had to take all of the technology with them. So before we go to another question, Doctor, with what strength did the Red Army have to confront the powerful Germany? Well, I think that the strength they had was the strength of unity, because before this war, there is a conspiracy on the French text, and this could be solved. And so does the Red government, the Red Army ensures that they are totally loyal to the Soviet leadership. And they want to become the armed expression, not only of the Russian people, but for all of the Soviet groups. And along with that, with all of the European groups that also in Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Albania, and Romania, there were insurrections of those people that are directed by the local communists. That was a great answer to the Red Army. But we also must have to say is that the British and the American armies, although now they don't want to recognize it, and yes, some helped with ammunitions, and everybody put something in. What the Red Army did was the most important effort they did in order to crash Germany. United States, like 300,000 to 400,000 dead, while the UK has 30 people. This is an evidence to see who was on the side of trying to put away with the damage. This is a correct military direction, without forgetting that the main military leader was the secretary of the party, and this was Stalin. So who did the high officials that were directing this operation have to report to? And with this, and the Nazis and the fascist allies, they were not a small group. It was not a group just against Germany. But unfortunately, they had the allies in Spanish. Well, David, I'm sorry that I made you wait so long. But I was looking into the pages of history, a history that you said a minute ago is necessary to keep alive in the conscience of the new generations. And since I know that you hold an active role in the midst of the Russians and Venezuela that carry out many acts of solidarity, but also with the history by its hand. I would like you to speak of this, please. Well, don't worry. For me, this was a class. It's important that we reivindicate the heroism of the Soviet Union and of the Red Army. We can be inspired as these new generations and part of the NGOs. We can be inspired in this heroism. If I'm not mistaken, in less than 2 months, France fell under the power of the war machinery of Germany. However, it took over 200 days of resistance that the Red Army had in this fight that marked the rout of the war in Stalingrad. Likewise, this spirit of resistance that was lived in St. Petersburg, with which happened for over 100 days, and for almost 1 million people died due to having a dignified morale and force of the Soviet Union that we had a representation in each one of these cities. So we also have to recall that it is vital that we keep on developing commemorations and finding the sense of solidarity in our history, so we can connect not only with the rhetoric of people, but from a human point of view. Everybody who participated in that war nowadays have children that are being felt in this remembrance of all of the lives that were lost. So in this sense of anti-imperialism, in this sense of nostalgia and resistance, but at the same time of vindicating the victory, of vindicating your honor, the peace, and their capacity of union. So based on that, we should build great movements that allow us to reivindicate the nationalism and procure through these days, like the V-Day, to connect in all of the spaces possible to celebrate. We as a people, the capacity we have to confront the imperialism. In this case, we speak of the German imperialism. But nowadays, we see great risks of fascism that come out in many parts of the world, where we should assume that heroic example of the German people to keep on organizing and concrete movements and political parties that advance in a determined way against the fascism of the imperialism all around the world. It is possible, and it has been proven, that you can obligate the bourgeoisie, and you can also build great unity, like the one that the Soviet Union had when they were able to advance in a new organization and in trying to defend liberty of the people within the development of the highest values that socialism reivindicates. So this is something we should recall. Thank you, David. Just like Dr. Ejido in our... Thank you very much. Now let's go to a pause. Now let's not forget that you have a question of the day through which you can connect. This is, in the context of the commemoration of V-Day, let's reflect. Is the world peace already guaranteed? Participate with us. When we're back, I keep on talking about this topic. Don't go anywhere. The end of World War II and brought up the bipolar world that brought over a reform in the world. The period known as the Cold War was characterized by a tension among two antagonic poles, one the capitalist and the socialist, led by the USSR. After World War II, the USSR implemented their political and economic system, and this was done with by the Warsaw Pact. And then the United States also did it with NATO and the Marshall Plan. In this context, the representatives of 50 countries met in the United Nations in San Francisco to write the UN Charter, signed in 1945, June 2nd. The representative of the founding countries, there were 6 main organs of this of the United Nations. Security Council, whose main objective was to maintain peace and security all over the world. In 1950s, it was a decade that marked the decolonization and liberty in Africa and many countries of Asia, which came along with nationalist movements in Latin America who were able to recover their own routes. The liberating movements of Asia and Africa that recovered their dignity and liberty pushed forward the movement of non-aligned countries. This happened in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955. After the separation of the USSR after 1989, there was a new reconfiguration of the world that, beyond marking the end of the Cold War, pushed forward many ideological changes of many countries. ending World War II and coming to our country, to our age. Do you think that now we do have world peace, or are we at the doors of a new great conflict? How about if it already began? Let's see. After World War II, in 1945, the possibility of a new armed force has begun in the thought of the contemporary thought. But how far away is that from the reality? According to experts of war philosophy, the world is at the door of a third world war of non-conventional characteristics. After seeing historical backgrounds of at least 95 wars, Aaron Closet of the University of Colorado said the historical patterns of the periodicity of war, that the peace could be more fragile. Those who try to detect when the next war will arise, Konstantin Sikov, president of the Academy of Artillery of Russia, says that the tensions increase when the regions have differences that are unsurmountable. And the elites, on the contrary, are trying to push forward their agenda. Other experts say that this new Third World War would have a different characteristics of fourth generation. This was established by William Lind in 1980s, where the confrontations will do by irregular forces that will surprise the enemy by tactics that are non-conventional. This terminology takes over the war of guerrillas, the asymmetric war, of low-intensity war, terrorism of state, covert actions, civil wars, terrorism and counterterrorism. A member of a Council of Integration of the Russian Academy of Science says that the new actors are not the countries, but now the actors would be the owners and beneficiaries of the world markets. This fourth generation war will use technology and communication, and this will have a lot of propaganda through fake news. The war of drugs by drug trafficking and the cooperation of international cooperation by which you could try to manipulate the adversary, and they're going to have control over the scarce resources. Contraband is trying to elude the market of the contrary with lower prices, and there will be manipulation of technology, both civil and military. Let's continue recalling the images of World War II. Now I want to add Alejandro Vergara. He's a politologist. He's an expert of international relationships to speak of how the world is doing now and this reconfiguration of the world. Thank you, Alejandro, for coming. Thank you, Ray, and thank you for having us here. Alejandro was coming in a motorcycle. He was late, and he came in a motorcycle and with a mask. Well, the configuration of the current world, if the history doesn't repeat itself, at least it replies itself. But what we see with the pandemic, this is like the state of World War II. Because the world is on its tiptoes, we can make comparisons in the sense that we need international cooperation among the big powers, and we need multilateralism. However, nowadays, you may correct me if I'm wrong, we don't need two contrary bands, but only one where they're at fight with somebody else. Well, after World War II, there was the Cold War, and they were both fighting to be superior over the other. And what we saw was so terrible that we put United States as the hero of World War II when it really was Russia, and everything based on propaganda. This was the the success of the propaganda. Nowadays, we don't need that. We need to cooperate. We need that the world leaders meet and they work together, find a solution, a viable solution. But however, contrary to this, we see that countries that became world leaders, like the United States, are betting on unilateralism. Because because Donald Trump and nationalism, because Donald Trump bets on America for the Americans. And of course, we understand America as North America. And we don't need those nationalism. We need, for this global situation, we need a global answer. So this pandemic affects everybody. It's a democratic virus. This is what the Iranians said, because if you're rich or poor, you can still be affected. So we have global problems. We should have global answers. How do you think this goes? Well, we can see that regardless that we are in a globalized world, we need to give answers to that globalization. This pandemic has put on the table questions of topics such as sovereignty. So do you think that the neoliberal globalization is what is needed now? Well, we see that in the countries where the neoliberal globalization are the countries that are doing worse. So if we think that that's the way out, we're totally wrong. Alejandro, you spoke of the propaganda, and the propaganda as a weapon of war. That was one of the materials that we were doing, just the last one. We spoke about this Third World War, that we're at the doors of this World War. Do you think that it's ongoing? Do you think that we're at the doors of it? What is your opinion on this? Well, I think that yes, we could say that a new type of war where the propaganda holds a fundamental role to put the United States at the forefront, like what they did in Second World War. For example, the United States calls the Chinese virus to this thing instead of finding solutions. We don't need confrontations among us. What do you think is the big question nowadays? Well, I think is cooperation and multilateral cooperation. Multilateral. But is it possible in countries that have political differences? Well, of course. This is where the international organisms should step up that were created after World War II. But we've seen that they are in crisis even before the pandemic. This crisis of multilateralism has already existed. So some experts say that these international organisms should be revised because nowadays they are not working anymore. And for example, the United Nations Security Permanent Council should change. Of course, the Security Council of the United Nations, we see that there are no members of the BRICS, for example, that are emerging countries, and the quotas of voting in these organisms is totally uneven, just like the International Monetary Fund and other international organisms that's going to help the emerging countries as the other ones in the south. But what we need is real help. and not that type of help where, of course, they come with help, but we owe them for the rest of their lives. Well, beyond that we take up a loan, what you say is true. Who are we going to finance? Well, President Maduro said that it was time to create the International Humanitarian Fund. Well, yes, I totally agree with what the President said. And just like President Maduro said yesterday, that it's terrible that the United States is now using propaganda to blame the fault of their mismanagement on other countries. So let's bear in mind how many dead people they have in their country. And, of course, there are other countries that are satellites to the United States, like Brazil, where you see all of the dead and the infected. In terms of the revision of international organisms, going back to the United Nations, many experts agree that the resolutions that are debated in the United Nations should have the same weight. For example, the one that is always presented by Cuba that is asking to lift the embargo. Well, yes, it's unequal because these organisms are not answering, are not giving a democratic answer to many of the requests. So United Nations should be an arbitrary. But of course, what we see in the Western world, we see that the General Director is totally biased when it's time to make decisions. And for example, one person, speaking of Guterres, whose action is okay, but it doesn't make all of the organisms. But on the contrary, there are other people like Donald Trump that does affect all of their country and maybe humanity as a whole. Well, yes, it's true. Maybe they won't make a difference, but there are voices. And I think that we should go to other, like the emerging countries or the BRICS, and give them more insertion in these international organisms. Okay, you as a young analyst, let me ask you the following. Who do you think that should be part of the new Security Council of United Nations? Well, I think, well, if we speak of conditions, I think that we see the Russian posture as one of the strongest countries in the global, China, India, for being a country with high economic development, and others from the south. We can include Brazil. However, we have a regressive leader. Why not Venezuela? Well, I would say so, yeah, Venezuela, because Venezuela has showed the world how they have been able to manage the pandemic in a coherent way. We have a number that is way below the numbers of any other country. And it was a country who led this summit between nations that represented many regions of the world, understanding South America, and we see that Venezuela was leading all of the continent. Well, of course, our strategic plan of Venezuela says that we want to make Venezuela a world leader, a pivotal actor. Here we have a real democratic participation, where I could say that the management of the pandemic, it's not only because of of the president that led us well, but it's also because the organizations, the social organizations, and the people itself organize themselves very well. So this is a regional example. I think President Maduro said it all. Without the people of Venezuela, we could not have done anything. Alejandro, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Rey. You're always invited. Let's go to our conclusions. The same actors that before were confronted in the Second World War, now they have a new order. For some aspects, it's a disorder. In this context, we ask ourselves if we're at the door of a third world war or if this conflict is already ongoing, once again putting at risk what we have the biggest prize, which is peace. The only thing that we should do is respect sovereignty, solidarity through the interconnection. Either we look after each other or we all will lose. The pandemic of COVID has made it very clear. This is all for today. Thank you very much.